More than 50 years after the assassination of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, his murder continues to mystify and intrigue. Now, Newsmax takes an extraordinary look at some of the theories and conspiracy theories not sanctified by history, and introduces you to the researchers dedicated to finding answers. Like movie director Oliver Stone, who says the Warren Commission got it wrong in finding that Kennedy's assassination was the work of a lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, who in turn was killed by another lone gunman, Jack Ruby. The producer of the controversial film JFK believes the military-industrial complex conspired to kill America's 35th president. We'll meet legendary political operative Roger Stone, whose insider political knowledge has led him to believe Kennedy's vice president and successor, Lyndon Baines Johnson, masterminded the assassination. We'll introduce you to Dr. Cyril Wecht, considered one of America's top forensic pathologists. He was the lone dissenter in 4 official examinations into the Kennedy assassination, arguing the prevailing single-bullet theory is inconsistent with President Kennedy's head wounds. Meet certified senior crime scene investigator Sherry Feister, who, using modern CSI methods, concluded Kennedy was shot from the front. Contrary to the Warren Commission's finding, the president was shot from behind. We'll also hear from Dr. Gerald Posner, who rebuts conspiracy theories in his best-selling book Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK. Posner's book is considered the definitive account and concludes Oswald acted alone, there was no second gunman on the grassy knoll, and the CIA was not involved. Putting the Kennedy presidency and assassination into perspective are Boston Globe national security reporter Brian Bender and presidential historian Dr. Robert Watson.
Hello and welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm Kathleen Walter. 50 years after the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, Americans continue struggling to accept the findings of the Warren Commission, the government inquiry into the assassination of America's 35th president. In fact, recent polls show a clear majority suspect there was a conspiracy behind Kennedy's assassination. Secretary of State John Kerry said he doesn't believe Oswald acted alone. And no less a personage than Robert F. Kennedy Jr. recently said the Kennedy family doesn't believe the lone gunman theory. If Oswald didn't do it or didn't do it alone, the list of possible suspects is long. Was Kennedy the victim of the CIA, the Mafia, Cuban President Fidel Castro, the KGB, or his successor LBJ? We'll explore those theories in this broadcast, but first, a look back at that fateful day in Dallas when America lost not only a president, but also her innocence.
Thursday, November 21st, 1963, President Kennedy arrives in San Antonio, Texas. He'd carried the Lone Star State by a narrow margin in the 1960 election. His trip there is political.
Here's one of the ironies and tragedies of history is he probably shouldn't have had to go to Dallas. There was an important senator named Yarborough, and he has a huge falling out with Lyndon Johnson, the vice president, who's a Texan. And Texas was a Democratic vote, but starting in the 60s, you see that it's a very conservative, socially conservative religious state. So the Democrats were worried about losing the state, and 2 of the political titans of Texas, Yarborough and LBJ, are having this big split, this big rift. So Kennedy kind of goes down there for a number of reasons, but one of them is to try to heal this rift, unite the Democratic Party, and breathe some air into the Democratic Party and to offset the Republican challenges.
Kennedy delivers a dedication speech for the U.S. Air Force School of Aerospace Medicine at Brooks Air Force Base in San Antonio. His message there is one of unity.
More than 3 years, I've spoken about the new frontier, which is not a partisan term, and it's not the exclusive property of Republicans or Democrats. It refers instead to this nation's place in history, to the fact that we do stand on the edge of a great new era, filled with both crisis and opportunity, an era to be characterized by achievement.
That afternoon, it's on to Houston. The presidential party consists of the president and his wife, the First Lady Jackie Kennedy, Vice President and Mrs. Johnson, and Texas Governor and Mrs. John Connally. That evening, the president speaks to the League of United Latin American Citizens and attends a dinner for Congressman Albert Thomas.
In Texas and the nation, change has been the law of life. Growth has meant new opportunities for this state. Progress has meant new achievements. And we dare not look back now. In 1990, the age of space will be entering its second phase. And our hopes in it to preserve the peace, to make sure that in this great new sea, as on earth, the United States is second to none.
The morning of November 22nd, and with less than 4 hours to live, Kennedy attempts to mediate a truce between Vice President Johnson and Senator Yarborough. Then it's breakfast with the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce.
When he arrives there was a funny moment that is often retold by historians, that a huge crowd in Fort Worth gathered, and probably most of them were there to see Jackie, not John.
2 years ago, I said that, introduced myself in Paris by saying that I was the man who had accompanied Mrs. Kennedy to Paris. I'm getting that same sensation as I travel around Texas. Nobody wonders what Lyndon and I wear.
The president delivers what will become his last public words.
This is a very dangerous and uncertain world. We would like to live as we once lived, but history will not permit it. The balance of power is still on the side of freedom. We are still the keystone and the arch of freedom, and I think we will continue to do as we have done in our past, our duty. I'm confident, as I look to the future, that our chances for security, our chances for peace are better than they've been in the past. And the reason is because we're stronger. And with that strength is a determination to not only maintain the peace, but also the vital interests of the United States.
At 11:37, Air Force One arrives in Dallas at Love Field.
The crowds were gigantic. And Kennedy comes down the tarmac. They get in a vehicle. They drive through Dallas, meeting with VIPs, huge crowds. In the limo, there's Texas Governor John Connally and his wife, and then behind them, President Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy. The irony was that morning, it was a bit cool, bit cold and rainy that morning. So there's a question about, should we have the roof on the limo? It was rainy that morning. Had the rain stayed, they would have had the roof on the limo, but the weather cleared.
At 12:50, the motorcade begins the 11-mile journey to the Dallas Trade Mart, where the president is scheduled to deliver a speech. A radio news reporter describes the motorcade as it makes its way through Dallas.
The president's car is now turning onto Elm Street, and it will be only a matter of minutes before he arrives at the Trade Mart. I was on Simmons Freeway earlier, and even the freeway was jam-packed with spectators waiting their chance to see the president as he made his way towards the Trade Mart. It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route. There's numerous people running up the hill alongside Elm Street, there by the Simmons Freeway. Several police officers are rushing up the hill at this time. Stand by just a moment, please. Something has happened in the motorcade route. Stand by, please. Parkland Hospital, there has been a shooting. Parkland Hospital has been advised to stand by for a severe gunshot wound. I repeat, a shooting in the motorcade in the downtown area. Parkland Hospital has been advised to stand by for a severe gunshot wound. The president's car is now going past me. The limousine is now traveling at a very high rate of speed. Secret Service men standing up in the limousine. They are armed with submachine guns. It appears as though someone in the limousine might have been hit by the gunfire.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. some 38 minutes ago.
To have a young, charismatic, active president in the midst of so many things taken at such a young life, I think the country lost a lot of its innocence. And I think you can see that through the tumultuous decade of the 60s that followed. It's always interesting to go back and contemplate the what if. But what if Kennedy had lived, how perhaps the civil rights movement or Vietnam or a number of things may have been different as a result.
Approximately 45 minutes later, Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit is shot dead. A 24-year-old Texas schoolbook depository worker named Lee Harvey Oswald, an ex-Marine sniper, is taken into custody and charged with murder. And aboard Air Force One, a new president rises to power. Coming up, events take a bizarre turn with the death of Lee Harvey Oswald at the hands of nightclub owner Jack Ruby. But does America get the truth from the Warren Commission? President Kennedy had been shot and Governor Connally had been wounded before hundreds of spectators in a Dallas, Texas motorcade. 48 hours later, the man arrested for Kennedy's killing, Lee Harvey Oswald, was himself killed.
This bizarre sequence of double killings raised great questions. Who actually fired the shots that killed Kennedy? Why did Ruby shoot Oswald? Was there a conspiracy? Were right-wingers involved? Was it a Russian plot, a Cuban plot?
The new president, Lyndon Johnson, established the Warren Commission of 7 prominent Americans to investigate. Led by its chairman, Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren, the commission interviewed hundreds of witnesses, some featured here in this CBS News special.
Mrs. Oswald, how old was Lee when he went in the Marine Corps?
Lee was exactly 17 years old when he went in the Marine Corps. He enlisted on his birthday.
Mrs. Oswald, why do you think your son went to Russia?
I think my son was sent to Russia. You see, Lee knew Russian fluently.
Where did he learn this?
This is what I was going to tell you. He learned this while in the Marines, because Lee was in the Marines and only out 3 days when he went to Russia. So Lee had to learn this while in the Marines.
I heard the first shot. I recognized it for what I thought it was. I had time to turn, to try to see what had happened. I was in the process of turning again before I felt the impact of a bullet. Now, obviously, if the bullet that hit me before I could hear it. I was never conscious of the sound of the second bullet at all. I never heard the second bullet. After I said, my God, they're going to kill us all, I, of course, didn't know that they'd actually hit the president.
This man, same man I had saw prior to the president's arrival, was in the window and taking aim for his last shot. After he fired the last or the third shot, he didn't seem to be in a great rush, hurry. He seemed to pause for a moment to see if for sure he accomplished his purpose, and he brought the gun back to rest in upright position as though he was satisfied.
The commission labored for 10 months and concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in killing Kennedy and wounding Governor Connally, and that Jack Ruby also acted alone when he killed Oswald 2 days later. To this day, its findings remain controversial.
It's clear that over the last 50 years, there's an avalanche of evidence that shows that the official story, the Warren Commission, was, as someone put it better than I, a house of cards. It just doesn't hold up to scrutiny.
Some say the trajectory of the bullets didn't square with Oswald's position high on the 6th floor of the Texas Schoolbook Depository. Others believe a second gunman, perhaps on the grassy knoll of Dealey Plaza, took part in the shooting.
We can look at everything from acoustical evidence, the medical evidence, how we make determinations about where shots originated, speaking towards directionality. I think the blood spatter that we have, available evidence, everything points to more than one shooter.
And in a separate inquiry, the House Select Committee on Assassinations would agree, concluding that there was another assassin shooting with Oswald.
The Warren Commission report is invalid. It is scientifically absurd. The single bullet theory that has one bullet producing 7 wounds in Kennedy and Connally, moving in a vertical and horizontal gyrated fashion, breaking 2 large bones in Governor Connally, and yet emerging in pristine condition with a weight loss of only 1.5% and with no deformation at all other than from the impact of the firing mechanism at the base of the bullet. And then you go on from there. The incompetence of the pathologist who did the autopsy, 2 guys at the Naval Hospital in Bethesda who had never done a gunshot wound autopsy in their entire careers, who mislocated the location of a bullet hole in the back of the president's head by 4 inches. A 6-year-old kid would do a better job with a plastic mold and a roller.
Others believe in an even broader conspiracy.
Okay. One is Lyndon Johnson killed John Kennedy. Lyndon Johnson and John Kennedy could not stand one another. Politics makes for strange bedfellows, and Kennedy, as a perceived liberal Northeastern young guy, needed to pick a Southern good old boy, established senator, to balance his ticket. And ticket balancing occurs today in both political parties. So the two never liked one another. So Lyndon Johnson was ambitious, wanted to be the president. So that's one conspiracy theory. Another one, the Soviets had Kennedy killed. He upped Khrushchev in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Oswald was in the Soviet Union getting instructions on, he was their sleeper agent. 3, the Cubans did it. Castro always disliked Kennedy. Castro was embarrassed and was angry over the Bay of Pigs fiasco, the attempt to assassinate him. So Castro was somehow providing fodder. 4, the mob. The mob was angry because but theoretically, supposedly the mob in Chicago and West Virginia, which were the 2 critical votes, helped Kennedy get elected with promises from Kennedy's old man. Then what does Kennedy do instead of helping the mob or ignoring the mob? His brother, as Attorney General, goes after the mob. And 5, Sam Giancana and some of the mob bosses had a personal vendetta because John Kennedy, Frank Sinatra, and others are sleeping with their mistresses. So there's all sorts of conspiracy theories, and I'm just scratching the surface.
Speculation over one of history's most famous political assassinations has some researchers digging deeper for answers. When we come back. Some conspiracy theorists have argued that Kennedy planned to end the involvement of the United States in Vietnam and was therefore targeted by those who had an interest in sustained military conflict. In his 1991 blockbuster movie JFK, Hollywood director Oliver Stone explored the possibility that Kennedy was killed by a conspiracy involving the military-industrial complex. Stone's film examined the events leading to the assassination and alleged subsequent cover-up through the eyes of former New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison, who was played by Kevin Costner. Garrison prosecuted Clay Shaw on the charge that Shaw and others were involved in a conspiracy with elements of the CIA in Kennedy's assassination. He was the only person prosecuted in connection with the assassination and was acquitted.
Eisenhower had built a machine that was enormous, and that was what the problem was, that when Kennedy comes to office, he's facing a country armed to the teeth and with generals who are essentially want to say, let's go now. And I thank God that John Kennedy had some experience of war. He had a lot of experience. He was a man of character, not like some of the presidents we've had since. He was a man who could say no to the generals. Do you think Obama would have said no to the generals now? Never. Couldn't say no to them on Afghanistan. Imagine the pressure that Kennedy was under. But he'd been at war with them now for 3 years, same time trying to appease them, trying to work his way. Worst of all, he fired Dulles and that group and Bissell. Firing Dulles is like firing the high priest in this country. You don't do that. But he did it. So his fate was being sealed that year. My point is that by the time Johnson comes back in, it's a reversal of policy, essential policy. And Johnson is at war in Vietnam. He sends the first ground troops in March of '65, and he starts covert actions right away in '64. But everything Johnson does is the old way, the Eisenhower way.
Upon JFK's theatrical release, Stone's film became embroiled in controversy, with major American newspapers running editorials accusing him of taking liberties with historical facts, including the implication that President Johnson was part of a coup d'etat to kill Kennedy.
I have directed the armed forces to prepare for any eventuality.
According to Boston Globe national security reporter Brian Bender, recently released government files show Kennedy had indeed taken more of a dovish position when it came to Vietnam and Castro's Cuba.
President Kennedy was often thought of as the epitome of the Cold Warrior, like all presidents were during the Cold War. But it's clear from newly released government files that he was also at the same time trying to figure out a way that maybe there could be a rapprochement with the Soviets, where the United States could avoid getting embroiled in proxy wars against communism. And one particular example that came out recently was a secret State Department cable that President Kennedy had approved that would be sent to the American ambassador in India, who at that point was John Kenneth Galbraith. And the cable laid out how Galbraith was going to use the Indian government as a go-between between President Kennedy and Ho Chi Minh in North Vietnam. And that cable was never sent because Defense Secretary Robert McNamara and others basically quashed it and said, there's no way we can reach any sort of agreement with Ho Chi Minh. And this is in 1963, so very early in the Vietnam War. But I think another new example of how President Kennedy, while he was clearly preparing to confront the Soviets, at the same time he was kind of playing both sides to see, is there another way out of this?
So how does this support the theory of the coup d'etat at the hands of the military-industrial complex?
I'm not sure that it supports the theory that the U.S. government or elements within it killed him, but it certainly provides more of a motive. And obviously in any murder case you need the means, the motive, and the opportunity. And I think in this case, some of the new information about President Kennedy's approach to the Cold War, the fact that he was not buying hook, line, and sinker what the generals and the CIA were telling him, obviously provides more of a motive if you're someone who believes that elements within the U.S. government wanted him out of the way.
The CIA, this was a CIA-directed, orchestrated plot. Kennedy was infuriated with the CIA. They had suckered him in on Cuba, and they were doing things all around the world that he did not know about. They had established essentially their own government. The CIA, for people who don't know, go back. These are all matters of record. They orchestrated assassinations of political leaders in Guatemala, in Chile, in Vietnam, and elsewhere. They did whatever they wanted to. And then following the Bay of Pigs fiasco, Kennedy was infuriated, and he said, and he stated, Senator Mike Mansfield, the Democratic Majority Leader, was in his office. Kennedy had a piece of paper, a memorandum of some kind, tore it up into pieces, threw it in the air and said, this is what I intend to do with the CIA. President Harry Truman, 1 month after the assassination, had a letter published in the New York Times in which he talked about the CIA and that they were doing things that they were not ever originally intended to do. So there's no question. What the CIA was looking at was 5 more years of John Kennedy, very likely to be followed by 8 years of Bobby Kennedy. What was going on in the world at that time? Well, aside from this country, voting rights and civil rights and the turmoil going on internally, look internationally. You had Cuba, you had the Cold War with Russia, you had emerging China, a serious problem, and you had the Vietnam War that was getting hotter and expanding all the time. So, people that were not happy with what Kennedy intended to do, establishing peace with Russia, or at least a détente with Khrushchev, backing off the Cuban situation, etc., pulling back and out of Vietnam, these are not the things that these people wanted to accomplish. Well, what do? You say, hey, well, it's just like a ball game. Wait till we come up in the 9th inning, or a hockey game, 3rd period, or a basketball game, 2nd period. No, 13 years is a lifetime in the political evolution of a country. And you're not going to sit back and see the country, in your eyes, going to hell in a basket. And so you can't defeat the Kennedys at the polls with their charisma, their money, their charm, their constituencies, etc. There's only one way. and that's physical elimination. That's assassination. That's the overthrow of the government. It's coup d'etat in America is exactly what happened on November 22nd, 1963.
Could LBJ have killed Kennedy? Why one legendary political operative says yes when we come back.
This is a sad time for all people. We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed. For me, it is a deep personal tragedy.
When Lyndon Johnson succeeded President Kennedy, legendary political consultant Roger Stone was just in grade school. Like many alive that day, he remembered exactly where he was when Kennedy was shot.
I was in elementary school. In my classroom, when they announced over the public address system that the president had been shot and killed, a number of my schoolmates were crying, and the teacher said to me, "Roger, what's the matter? Aren't you upset?"
Roger Stone has played a role in the election of Republican presidents from Richard Nixon to Ronald Reagan to George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. He is the author of the new bestseller, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ. Stone believes that LBJ not only played a role in Kennedy's assassination, but also masterminded the whole affair.
I think it's important to note, first of all, that Lyndon Johnson blackmailed his way onto the 1960 ticket with information about John F. Kennedy's sexcapades, which he got from the files of his close friend and ally, J. Edgar Hoover. So he blackmailed his way onto the ticket. In 1961, Johnson's right-hand man, Senate Secretary Bobby Baker, on the day of the inauguration, says JFK will not live to fulfill his term and he will die a violent death. We also know that Johnson was facing political extinction, that he was being investigated in both the Bobby Baker scandal in the U.S. Senate and being investigated in the Billy Sol Estes Texas swindles. Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, who detested Johnson, was committed to removing him from the ticket and sending him to prison. So Johnson was a man looking into the abyss. Johnson's mistress, Madeline Brown, his mistress of 21 years, who bore him a son, she tells us that on the morning of the assassination, Lyndon Johnson says to her, after today, I won't have to put up with those Kennedy SOBs anymore. So, and then lastly, the fingerprint evidence of a Johnson crony, a Johnson hitman found in the Texas School Book Depository. So I think all of those things add up to overwhelming evidence that Johnson is at least the linchpin. Now, there's clearly the involvement of at least a rogue element of the CIA. On his deathbed, E. Howard Hunt, who's in Dallas that day, working for the CIA, tells us Lyndon Johnson is the mastermind of the conspiracy.
So are you saying that Johnson killed his way to power?
No question about it. I think that he did it as self-preservation, and then, of course, he was in a unique position working with J. Edgar Hoover to cover the crime up. Hoover concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald was the killer and that he'd acted alone. Within 72 hours of the assassination, he published his report and then, in essence, insisted that the Warren Commission rubber stamp it, which they did.
Stone also claims that within 4 hours of the assassination, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover told then former Vice President Nixon that a communist had killed Kennedy. Nixon, he says, believed the story until he discovered a link between President Johnson and Jack Ruby.
Then when he sees Jack Ruby on television shooting Oswald, he recognizes Ruby. Ruby, whose name was Jack Rubenstein, had come to Nixon through Murray Schotner, who was a Nixon aide in 1947. At the request of Congressman Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon had hired Jack Ruby and put him on the House Un-American Activities staff as a paid informant. He did this as a courtesy to Congressman Lyndon Johnson. So in other words, Nixon saw Ruby shoot Oswald and recognized Ruby as a Johnson man. Nixon told me this. Nick Ruey, who was the U.S. ambassador to Iceland, actually was with Nixon at the time Nixon was watching on live TV. He said the old man turned white as a ghost, turned to Ruey and said, "I know that guy." We also know that House payroll records show that Jack Rubenstein was hired for the committee at the request of Congressman Richard Nixon in 1947.
Did President Nixon ever tell you that he thought that LBJ was behind Kennedy's assassination?
He said the following. He said, Johnson and I both wanted to be president. The difference was I wasn't willing to kill for it.
Coming up, one Kennedy assassination expert says it's time to put to rest one of the nation's most enduring murder mysteries.
"50 years after President Kennedy's assassination and millions of dollars later, his death has become a booming cottage industry for conspiracy theorists. Lawyer Gerald Posner is the author of the best-selling book Case Closed. Many say it is the definitive book on the subject, and Posner says all those skeptics simply got it wrong.
Well, I'm not surprised that most Americans think it's a conspiracy. I mean, first of all, we are a skeptical nation, and we're skeptical increasingly from the time of the Kennedy assassination. That's sort of the mother of all conspiracy theories. And then we ran into Vietnam, the lies over Vietnam. We ran into Watergate, Iran-Contra. People lost faith in government, and they came to believe that government can sometimes do nefarious things and plot against the best interests of its own people.
Posner concludes that it was one assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, who killed the president back in 1963. One man, one gun, 3 bullets, no conspiracy.
There are two different things, I think, about the assassination that make me believe that Oswald acted alone. That's because unless you get to understand Lee Harvey Oswald and who he was, how he tried to kill a U.S. military army general just a few months before he killed Kennedy, how he killed a police officer, J.D. Tippit, right after the assassination, what he thought his place in history was, how he had been a loser in life, how he was thought of as being gay in the Marines. They threw him in the shower and called him Mrs. Oswald, how he wanted to stand up and be somebody. You can have no idea or feeling for the why of the assassination. One of the great failures of the Warren Commission is they didn't explain motive. They never told us why this kid would want to kill Kennedy. When you understand Oswald, you understand why Kennedy died. Then the question becomes, okay, I understand Oswald, and I understand he would want to kill Jack Kennedy and put himself in the history book, but did he? Could he have? And then you look at the forensics evidence to see if that's possible. And what the forensics and ballistics evidence shows you is this, without any question in my view, and I know many people disagree with this, that the only shots that hit the president that day in Dealey Plaza were fired from behind the president. If there was a front shooter, the world-class assassin at the Grassy Knoll, that shooter missed everybody. Missed the president, missed Mrs. Kennedy, missed the governor, missed the governor's wife, missed the car, missed all the people standing on the other side. That shot went somewhere astray. The world-class shooter must have fired up in the air because he must have slipped or she slipped at the last moment. The only assassin, even if it's a world-class assassin, you think it was a Corsican assassin, firing in Dealey Plaza that day that hit the president, was firing from the direction of the school book depository. Oswald's gun was used to the exclusion of any other gun in the world. We know that from ballistics. The bullets were found in Kennedy's brain, fired from that gun to the exclusion of any other gun. People say, oh, by the way, it was a lousy gun, lousy scope. How could he have made the shots? Well, somebody made the shots that day using that gun, because that was the only gun that was used. So what I always conclude from Dealey Plaza is that Oswald fired the shots. He was left on the 6th floor of the depository by his colleagues. He was the one who was there. He was the one who escaped. He's the one who killed the policeman afterwards. The question that I found the most difficult was not concluding that he was the shooter, but whether he did it for himself or whether he was part of a conspiracy. That's where I spent most of my time. And in the end, the Oswald that I came to understand wasn't capable of being used by conspirators because he was too unstable, and they knew that.
We asked Gerald Posner to debunk the skeptics and for his take on some of the more popular conspiracy theories, beginning with the military-industrial complex.
You know, one of my favorite ideas is that we live in a country in which the government is basically inefficient. It can't build a homeless shelter on time or within budget. It can't roll out a website for healthcare without having it crash every other minute. But somehow, there is a nefarious part of the secret government that does everything to peak efficiency. Most government, completely inefficient Keystone Cops, but there's a group of James Bond guys behind the door, and they pull it off fantastic. They kill the president in Dallas in '63, and it's the perfect crime. They keep the cover-up rolling even though hundreds of people are involved. The military-industrial complex, together with the CIA, together with the mafia, people who are thought of as behind the Kennedy assassination, were working together in 62 and in 63. They had a mission to kill a head of state, and it was Fidel Castro. They had been authorized by Bobby Kennedy, the head of the Justice Department, to go ahead and assassinate the Cuban leader. So we have the U.S. military-industrial complex, the CIA, and the mob trying to kill a head of state. They try 11 times, they can't even wound him. But the same group of clowns who can't remove Castro, for some reason, were able to come to Dallas, pull off the perfect crime, and 50 years later, we can't pick up a trace of it. I just don't believe it.
On whether LBJ had knowledge of or masterminded Kennedy's assassination.
The one against LBJ, the only evidence against it is twofold. A, that the assassination happened in Texas. Okay, so it was, the powerful senator from Texas. And the second thing is that under the theory of crime, we always say, everyone who watches NCIS or Law and Order knows the first question in the interrogation room is, okay, who had the most to gain? That means that in every presidential assassination, the number one suspect better be the vice president, because the vice president has the most to gain in every presidential assassination. So in this case, the vice president, LBJ, and the president, Kennedy and his brothers, didn't like LBJ very much. That adds to the sense of the theory, but there's just no evidence of it at all.
On whether the mafia or the mob killed Kennedy.
So the challenge I've always thrown out to conspiracy theorists is, don't tell me the mob hated Kennedy. Don't tell me the mob wanted him dead. Show me that they used Oswald. That's the tie to get into the assassination. That's where nobody can find the evidence.
Did Castro order Kennedy killed?
He knows that if he tries to use an assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, an unstable 24-year-old who was thrown out of Russia in part because he was deemed crazy by the KGB, and anything goes wrong, Cuba is going to be a flat sand field. The U.S. is going to take his island out, not only remove him from power, but that's going to be the end of it. That's a gamble that Castro is too smart to have ever made, especially using Oswald. I just don't see it.
And what about the KGB?
KGB had nothing to gain and everything to lose. It is true that Kennedy faced them down in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that Khrushchev was personally embarrassed. But to go from personally embarrassed to deciding to kill the president is an enormous leap of faith, and to utilize in any role whatsoever Lee Harvey Oswald, who had been in the Soviet Union as a defector, who your own psychiatrists have interviewed, and your own conclusion, we now know because the Russians have released it in the last decade, concludes that he's unstable, would be a gamble so great that you would essentially have to win the equivalent of mega lottery to have pulled those odds out. I just don't see it.
Next, thousands of pages of investigative documents remain classified by the U.S. government. Meeting some of the most noted Kennedy assassination researchers in the world makes us realize that, for many, there are still unanswered questions about that tragic day in Dallas. After all this time and long after official inquiries have ended, thousands of pages of government documents pertaining to the assassination remain classified by the U.S. government. Because the contents of these files are only partially known, they continue to fuel conspiracy theories. Researchers hope they'll shed new light on what the U.S. government knew about Lee Harvey Oswald and pull back the cloak of mystery about what happened to JFK on November 22, 1963.
There are still certainly hundreds, if not thousands, of pages of government files that might shed new light, maybe not give us an answer, but certainly would provide more dots that people, researchers, could connect. So I think the government is withholding information, and I think 50 years later, I think that's something realistic that could actually be done, and that is to pressure the government to, if not release all this stuff, at least give us a better explanation as to why half a century later this stuff is so sensitive.
Most people don't know the truth. Some people believe they know the truth, of course, on both sides. If the truth means that the president was shot by 2 or more people, and that it was something far more sinister than a lone nut, i.e. Lee Harvey Oswald, that is not the truth. Now, if some critics believe that, yes, it was a conspiracy, and they can tell you exactly where the shooters were located and what the sequence of shots was and how many shots, et cetera, that's not quite the truth either, but it's closer to the truth.
What Fletcher Prouty and what Jim Garrison were saying back then holds up. It really holds up.
I think the truth is very hard to get at. What's amazing is that the mainstream media has pounded home the Warren conclusions and have built this wall where anyone who questions them or disagrees, you're a nut, you're a loony, you're some kind of crazy person.
We're going to know a portion of the truth. I don't think that we're going to find the smoking gun. I don't think we're going to have someone come forward and say, you know what, yes, I ordered that. Yes, I'm the one that pulled the trigger. Yes, I was a part of the actual shooting. I don't think that's ever going to happen.
The real question to be asked of conspiracy theorists is, when, if ever, are you going to not just say it's a conspiracy, but give us an answer as to what happened? You know, at a certain point in history, 5 years after the assassination, you can say, I think it's a conspiracy, but I don't know what happened. 10 years later, you might be able to say that, or 15 years later, 20, it's pushing it, 25, 30. We're now half a century away from it. It's time to be able to say, this is what I think took place. Put it up for historians to look at, investigate, challenge, and dissect it. Nobody even offers an alternative theory because there isn't one that really stands up to any testing.
We know 98, 99% of the truth. I think it's the other 1% that intrigues us.